You can be the most creative nutbag on the planet, but if you're not able to talk to people, if you're not able to engage partners, open yourself up, kind of be vulnerable in a way, then you're never going to move forward.
Hello and welcome to Off the Lot. The film industry is changing fast, and if you want to make movies, it's time to become your own gatekeeper. If you've got a vision and the drive to make it happen, this podcast is for you.
We're your hosts, Ken Kabatoff and Anthony Epp, and every week we dive into the hustle, challenges, and real-world strategies of independent filmmaking. We talk to directors, producers, and industry pros about what it really takes to get your film made.
So if you're serious about making movies, hit follow or subscribe. It helps us keep this going. And if you like what you hear, spread the word, share the episode, leave a comment, and help more indie filmmakers find Off the Lot. Let's dive in. Mike Johnston is an award-winning Canadian producer and co-founder of Vancouver-based Studio 104 Entertainment, which has quickly risen on Playback's indie list in both 2023 and 2024. As a passionate champion of Canadian storytelling, Mike has produced acclaimed films including Wild Goat Surf and the documentary Curl Power, which became TELUS's top-performing theatrical release, screening on 73 screens across Canada.
Recently nominated for the Kevin Tierney Emerging Producer Award and named to Playback Magazine's 10 Most to Watch list, Mike continues to build international partnerships while creating diverse content that resonates with audiences worldwide. Today, Mike joins us to share insights on navigating Canada's independent film landscape, from securing funding through organizations like Telefilm to expanding distribution channels for Canadian stories in an increasingly competitive global market. Welcome to the show, Mike.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. And thanks for that great introduction. It's nice to hear it when it's read back to you.
Yeah, as though you wrote it yourself, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Mike, what initially sparked your passion for filmmaking, and how did that lead to being an independent producer today?
Well, it really goes back to one movie, which is Jaws. To me, it's the greatest movie of all time. I will accept no alternates. I will take no debate. That is the greatest movie of all time. To me, it's just there's something about that movie. It just has a little something of everything for everyone. But on top of that, I think as I grew up learning about the making of that film and the story behind the scenes, and what Steven Spielberg went through, the getting fired almost every day, 25 years old, making this movie on the water with this shark that just wouldn't work, that almost became more inspiring than the movie itself. And this idea of this movie that almost ruined his career ended up becoming the thing that made his career. So that I think that I had always had an interest in drama and acting in high school and things like that. So I always had an interest in the arts and that sort of thing. But I think Jaws was really the thing that lit the fuse for filmmaking. That being said, I thought for a long time I wanted to be a director. And, even going to film school at the University of British Columbia, going through the film production program there, I went into the program and exited the program as a director. I made films there as a director. I did support other projects as a producer as well. But, from a career perspective, coming out of film school, I was still very much, I want to be a director. And when we started our company in 2019, I got more, certainly did more producing that way. But I think it was, around 2019, 2020 that sort of sat down and sort of had, a conversation with myself and was like, I think I always view the film business, the film industry as this big ecosystem. So it's like, how can I contribute to the ecosystem in a way that makes the most sense? And, I think I was seeing just a shortage of experienced producers, or just a shortage of people who wanted to produce. There's a lot of directors who were producing for themselves out of, need, but not a lot of people who were, standing up, raising their hand and saying, hey, I want to be a producer. So to me, that was in terms of how do I contribute to this ecosystem? How do I find a place where I can, sort of build a career, build a brand for myself? I found myself sort of slipping into producing that way. But it wasn't a straight and narrow path. It was a bit of, there were peaks and valleys to get there for sure.
That's really interesting. And how did you find your partners, and what's behind the name Studio 104?
Absolutely. No, we love to tell this story. I mean, so Studio 104, the name comes from at the University of British Columbia in the film production building, which was this old little building that was riddled with rats and a little bit of asbestos. everybody in the program knows that, so I'm not shocking anybody by saying that. But it's definitely a building. It's like amongst all these beautiful buildings at UBC, you would absolutely walk past, And within this building, there was only two rooms. There was room 2 and there was room 104. And room 104 is where we had all of our classes. And that's where I met my three partners, Andy Alvarez, Diana Perry, and Martin Calvo. And the four of us formed Studio 104 Entertainment in 2019. So it comes from, humble beginnings to the establishment of that name in 2019.
That's great. And how do you divvy up the responsibilities at the company? Are you all producers? What are the roles? How do you work together?
We run the company very much like a collective, and that's how we started it. It was really like these four people who, we enjoy working together. We enjoy making projects together. We're not all producers in the same way. I think we all contribute in producer capacities. But for instance, Andy Alvarez is a very accomplished writer director. So she's working on new projects, developing new IP projects that she will direct under the company. Diana Perry is a very accomplished award-winning cinematographer. So she doesn't shoot every project that we produce at Studio 104, but it's something that we do make sure is available to her. And then Martin Calvo is a director producer. So he works with me on the production side of things, as well as developing and directing his own work.
Very interesting. And so as far as projects go, I mean, you've made now a couple feature-length documentaries, feature narrative, other short films as well, and we can dive into all of those things. But what is it about these projects that spoke to you, or like when you are in development mode and seeking something out, what's your process there? Do you have a roster of writers that you sort of work with and have gone to, or directors? What's your story there?
A lot of the projects that we get, and I wouldn't say that they're, and I wouldn't say that this is by design in any way, but we do get a lot of projects that are coming from a lived experience, or based on a true event. The writer may have experienced something or something to that event. For instance, the Wild Goat Surf is very much based on sort of the early days, younger years of the writer-director Caitlin Sponheimer living in the Okanagan, spending her summers in the Okanagan. So that kind of comes from that. We have some projects in development that are based on true events or inspired by life events of the writer-directors. So in a lot of ways, I think, when you say, why do these projects speak to us? I mean, I think it's for those reasons, is they have a very clear point of view. They come from that specific lived experience that feels very, one of one in a lot of ways. You want to sort of get behind them, help champion them, help sort of put them up on 2 feet. And that's something that's been exciting for us over the years.
Is there a particular like movie or project that kind of made you or transformed your understanding of what it means to be a movie producer, like for yourself or a project you worked on?
That's a good question. I mean, I think it was, I don't know that if it was a specific project, but something I found interesting is, coming out of film school, I almost felt that I really didn't know what a producer was. and
Yeah.
I don't want to sort of crap on the film program that I came from. But, from when I was producing films in film school, you're not really a tried and true producer in that sense. You're kind of you kind of get stuck with all the stuff that the other people don't want to do, that the director doesn't want to do, that the DOP and other members of the team don't want to.
You're more of a facilitator of some kind.
I think that's the perfect word, is facilitator. Yeah. And it's like, you're kind of just, yeah, it's a lot of paperwork. And so I think in that sense, it's like, it was hard to get excited about producing coming out of film school, because that's sort of what was taught to me, or that's what I knew. But I think as I sort of went along, got behind more projects, started producing more, I began to understand the role more fulsomely, and understand that I can have more agency in development and have more agency creatively and take on a bigger role. I'm not just a facilitator. So I think that's when I really sort of got excited about producing, because I think the number one thing I hear all the time is, oh, I don't want to be a producer because it's not creative, which I think is a completely incorrect statement. Like, even I remember listening to, you had Amber Ripley on, I think last week or a couple of weeks ago, and she was talking about how she contributes to projects in creative ways that are not necessarily writing the script, or not necessarily like, sitting side by side with the writer director. There's tons of ways that I get to be creative in a project that doesn't mean I'm typing the script myself. That's something that still to this day needs to be demystified. It's just not a true statement.
Yeah, it's so true. And so much of what we do is just problem solving, right? Both balancing the creative with the financial side of things. And as a director or a writer, you're up against, okay, well, we have to figure out the ending of this movie, but we can't afford to do it this way, or this way. What is something that we can do? And having a producer in those discussions is key because it's another perspective. And again, you get to be creative coming from that angle that maybe the director or the production designer, the cinematographer are not looking at. It really is a team effort in those instances. You also just said something really interesting to me about like demystifying what a producer does and going from like being a facilitator of sorts in film school to like actually producing your own work. And I'm curious about what that sort of moment was, or just like that switch for you where you graduated from UBC and the four of you said, okay, we're now going to form this company and we're going to make something. What was the first step? Like, what were you like, this is going to be the project that we do first, and this is what's going to help grow the company? Did that happen organically? Did somebody come in with a project, and like why that specific project? Because ultimately, being a producer, especially an independent like freelance producer, like it's a freelance gig. You have to figure out a way to get the next one. So this is interesting to me, and I know that a lot of like film school grads or directors, writers, and producers who want to be able to do this, I bet you they're wondering what that first step really is.
There was sort of a myriad of things that happened. I mean, number one, one of the reasons we decided to form our company was that, myself, Andy, Martin, Diana, like sort of straight out of film school, we were working on a lot of TV movies together. Pretty much that summer out of film school, we started on this stretch of TV movies, and we were riding together. I think at that point I was the only one who had a car. So we were all riding in my car to set every day. An hour to Langley every morning, you got a lot to talk about, and an hour back from Langley at night, you got a lot to talk about. So, we just talk about, ultimately, like, what are the things that we notice is being done correctly? What are the things that we're noticing are being done incorrectly? What would we do differently? And I think, we got to a point where it's like, we've seen a lot of what works. We've seen a lot of what doesn't work. By no means are we ready, but, let's just do it. And we started really having those conversations of like, okay, if the four of us started a company, what would that look like? And it was trying to figure out what that first project would be. At the same time of working on these Hallmark movies, on weekends, we would sort of shoot our own projects, have our friends out, no, obviously nobody gets paid, but, you have pizza and beer and that sort of stuff, and you try to make it a fun experience. But we were trying to, maintain that sort of creative excitement on the weekends, and by doing that sort of thing. So I think that helped sort of shepherd in the idea of starting the company, as we sort of had these few projects that we already had worked on together. And it was like, okay, this is feeling like something we could do. But I think actually one of the first projects that we did that sort of kicked us off was a Crazy Eights film that we did called Idols Never Die, which was directed by Jerome Yu. And I think we did that in February of 2019. I would also preface this by saying that wasn't like it was good timing in a sense of like I was working on the project, I was producing the project. We hadn't officially launched our company yet, but when the time for Crazy Eights came around, I was like, wouldn't it be great if we could sort of launch our company off the back of this? So, when Crazy Eights 2019 happened, when Idols Never Die played and launched there, that was sort of the official welcoming of our company. That was the first time you saw the logo, first time you heard what Studio 104 was. And we didn't have a deep inventory or a deep catalog or anything like that at that point. But that was sort of the start phase, I suppose. That was the first project out of the gate. From that, it was a good sort of push. We were able to bring in sort of a steady stream of smaller independent short films, either that we developed internally or that some folks were just coming to us and saying, hey, I've noticed your company. I will have the money to make this film. I don't know how to produce it. Will you guys help me produce it? And that was sort of the first year of our company, was a lot of that, like a mix of sort of internal development of smaller projects, as well as, if you want to call it, servicing some other projects as well.
With your narrative features, what is the budget range you've been working in with those films?
Generally, we've been in a budget of about 1.2 to 2.5 million. Canadian dollars. Those have been for domestic Canadian projects. And when I say that, I mean, fully Canadian financing. Some co-productions, the budgets can get a little bigger, but that has generally been sort of the range that we've worked in.
What would you say is a manageable budget for a good feature film? Like, obviously, we always want more money, but at what point does it become almost like prohibitive to making a good project? I mean, obviously, $250,000 films, and you can make those with Talent to Watch and things like that. But is there like a sweet spot budget range that you like to work within?
That's a good question. I mean, I would answer it sort of two ways. I mean, the first thing I'll say is like, if you're making a purely 100% domestic Canadian project, as soon as you start to climb close to the like 2 million, you're really hitting the ceiling of what's available from a soft money perspective. And I do just want to mention it's like the projects that we are largely putting together almost entirely soft money. And when I say soft money, I'm talking about Telefilm, I'm talking about CMF, Canada Media Fund, Creative BC, tax credits, that sort of thing, like almost entirely soft money for the most part. So when you're dealing with a model like that, once you climb close to 2 million, you're really hitting the ceiling of what's available. I've sort of found the sweet spot in the last couple years has been 1.7 to 1.8. Again, I'm sort of speaking from a position of this is what's available with the soft money resources we've had, and also dealing with sort of the downturn in the market to a degree. That's sort of been our sweet spot across a couple projects recently.
Yeah, that's interesting. This episode is coming out at a time where a whole bunch of people in the Western region have just been rejected from Telefilm. And I'd love to know about your your experience working with Telefilm over the last couple of years, and sort of how you navigated those waters, because you've been able to put these movies together with Telefilm, CMF, Creative BC, as you've been saying, and tax credits, of course. And I think that you've approached this system in a really smart way of like knowing, okay, well, this is kind of the threshold of what we can put together. So, how have you navigated those waters? Are there any tips or tricks with Telefilm that, other people can know about, like certain dollar amounts or whatever?
I think it's definitely like you have to be realistic. Like, sort of going back to your point, Anthony, is like everybody wants more money. And everybody thinks, I think thinks they can get more money. And I certainly know some of the first Telefilm applications I was putting in budgets much larger than, what they came out to be. And, it's one thing to say you can put together, a financing plan like that, but then if you make it to the next phase, you got to prove it.
Right.
You got to be able to
Yeah.
close that financing. And oftentimes that budget comes down. Almost every time I find it actually comes down. And of course, you want to move forward with, your plan A. That's always the goal. But more often than not, I find, we're always sort of leaning back on a plan B, plan C to close that financing. And part of that, one of the challenges I find with the soft money system is none of these people talk to each other. None of these organizations talk to each other.
Yeah.
The dates are all over the place. Let's get all these other systems aligned around that so that the dates line up and you actually have an opportunity to take advantage of all those funds that are out there. Because oftentimes I'm finding, when I do go and close financing, dates don't line up. So I have to
Right.
close at a lower level, then come back, go back later, hope I can get that extra money. If I get that extra money, great. I'll amend the financing. But it just creates more of a headache for both the producers and for the business affairs people in charge of administrating these funds, in my opinion. So that's one of the challenges I think that is absolutely able to be solved. We just got to get all these people in a room and actually have that conversation.
Yeah, exactly. Like your deadline's March, your deadline's June. Okay, let's get this together.
When you're approaching a new project, are you doing a test the waters with Telefilm first, or are you coming in with some kind of other financing like distribution or something like that that you've already predetermined before you hit Telefilm? Is that how I guess you tell us, how are you approaching the financing?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, so one thing I'll say is like so far for all the projects that we've done, we've accessed the Telefilm low budget program or the regional program. So that's budgets up to 3.5 million. We don't typically do talent to watch. We have not dipped our toe into the high budget or the national program yet. So we've always been the low budget program. And in that sense, on the low budget side, it's not a requirement that you have a Canadian distributor or a broadcaster attached at that time. In the high budget program, it is a requirement. So in that respect, with the lower budget projects, I do find that Telefilm is usually that first in money. A large part of that being is that the low budget projects typically coming from, at least on our side, we're working with a lot of newer directors or emerging directors. It might be their first feature. In a lot of cases, it's their first feature. So in that sense, it's, a first feature is really execution dependent, right? Like there's not a whole lot that, you can take to the sales market or you can take to a distributor and say, like, here's this like perfect huge package of like really well-rounded package that we want to bring to you. So I often find that Telefilm's that first in money, because if they're that first in money, then that kind of gives the confidence to a Canadian broadcaster like a Bell Media that it's like, okay, so there is merit to this project. It's scored high creatively. There's trust in the producing team. All these other various factors that Telefilm scores on, that then a broadcaster can get involved in, or a Canadian distributor can get involved in, or another soft money fund such as Creative BC or something like that can get involved in. So almost always it's first in. I will say, as we take on more projects, as they get more complex, we are trying to take them out to market. At the same time, we're trying to work with different levels of directors, different levels of filmmakers, trying to attach cast earlier on. That's always a bit tricky, especially in the current market position. So we are trying to diversify that approach. But I will say, on projects like Wild Goat Surf and some of the other Telefilm projects we put in the past, that's been the model.
Since obviously being on set is probably like the tiniest percentage of the amount of time that you spend as a producer, what would you say, let's go the opposite way. What would you say then is the biggest amount of time you spend as a producer these days? Or what takes up the most of your time?
Great question. Also a difficult question, because there's so many things that take up such a great deal of time.
Yeah.
But before I answer that question, I actually sort of just want to touch on something you said, Anthony, which I think is really interesting, is how like being on set is such a tiny part of my job, which again
Right.
is sort of demystifying the role of the producer, because there are so many different, you have line producers and executive producers and co-producers and associate producers. And we could probably do a whole podcast on a whole hour on defining the difference between all of those producers and their responsibilities. But something I do hear a lot from people who want to get into producing is, oh, I want to be a producer because I love being on set. I just want to spend more time on set. And it always sort of like, I'm like, what? I think what you mean, I think in those cases, people are, they're wanting to sort of be on the production management line producer side of things. And certainly at the low budget level, those roles are less delineated. The smaller the budget, the fewer people you have, that sort of thing. But I always respond to that question with, I find the more projects I do, the more producing I do, the more experience I gain, the less and less time I'm spending on set. So that's something I always like to clarify, is like, if there's really somebody out there that it's like, oh, I want to be a producer because I love being on set, then it's like, well, know this, depending on what you're going to do, that has different amounts of time on set, basically. But to answer your question more directly, what takes the most time? I mean, there's a number of things. I would say ultimately it's development takes the most time. And this is another thing I want to sort of touch on, is like, there's an idea that development is only script development. It's only getting the script from like a log line to an outline to a first draft or a second draft. Oh, and then I'm ready to go into Telefilm. Yes, that's a big part of it, but development encompasses so much more than that. I'm not just talking about packaging, like cast and things like that, but I mean like finding the right partners, because more and more partnerships are required to make projects happen. It's like the days of like one producer, one production company doing a project are largely behind us. You need the support of, one or two producers or one or two companies to make these happen. So really doing that due diligence, that's something that takes a long time.
That's interesting. How are you finding that here in Vancouver? Are you working with local companies or companies in other regions, or how are you navigating that?
It's a total mix. We work with other local companies to partner on domestic projects. For instance, Wild Goat Surf was a co-production between Quebec and BC. So we work with producers in other regions within Canada to do interprovincial co-productions.
That's
And we
great.
also work with producers internationally to do international co-productions. And that's a thing that takes a big chunk of time. And, a piece of advice that I like to impart to people is like, if you really want to be a successful producer, you have to get out of Vancouver. And what I mean by that is you don't have to leave Vancouver, but I mean you have to get off your ass and go to other places in Canada or other places around the world and make your presence known. And that was a big sort of learning lesson to me over the years. Is we're on a bit of an island in Vancouver is the reality. And
Right.
what I mean by that is all the broadcasters are based in Toronto. All of the distributors are based in Toronto. There even used to be a distributor called Pacific Northwest Pictures, which is based in Toronto. I mean, they've rebranded, renamed, and restructured, but all of that business is in Toronto. And while there's a great deal of work that can be done on Zoom and things like that, I truly believe first and foremost, this is a business of relationships, and to form relationships and maintain relationships, you have to get in front of people and you have
Yeah.
to meet with them face to face. So a great deal of a lot of what I do, I do a lot of travel, like I just returned from Hot Docs a couple weeks ago. We had our short film Delta Dawn was playing there, but that was not my primary purpose for being there. I was there to meet with broadcasters that we have relationships with, distributors that we have relationships with. And in some cases, I was pitching projects. In other cases, I was just needing to maintain relationships, just like checking in, like, how are you finding things? What are you buying? What's working for you? What's not working for you? And I try to do those check-ins, at least once or twice a year.
Yeah.
More if I can make it consistently to markets. The European film market that happens at Berlinale every year, that's a must attend, in my opinion, for independent producers, trying to finance and develop projects.
Yeah, that's really cool. Can you run us through what it's like as an independent producer to attend one of these markets, and sort of how you approach it, what your goal is, whether you're, selling something or just networking? What's it like?
Absolutely. Well, I mean, to answer that question, I'll paint the picture a little bit. When I the first market I ever went to was the European film market in February of 2023, so almost 2 years ago. I did that. I was very much trial by fire. I talked to a few producer colleagues, like, hey, what should I do to sort of prepare myself for this? And I made a few meetings ahead of time, but not to the scale that I should have. And I'll elaborate on that a bit. But I remember getting there, and at the European film market, they largely take over sort of three locations in Berlin, in the center of Berlin. They take over this big museum for 2 weeks. They take over the Marriott Hotel, and then they take over another hotel right next to I forget which one, but they take over two hotels in this big museum. So I went to this museum. I walk in, and it was just immediate like overload because every film commission, every sales company, every distributor is there, and they have booths of varying sizes. And there's independent production companies that are there that might have a table or a booth, or some of the bigger distributors have a whole wing. And I remember just like sort of walking through all the different rows and like walking through the Canada pavilion and things like that. Sorry, I'm just pausing for a second because my guard dog thinks she hears something. So.
We have a friend.
Of course.
Yeah.
So I was walking through the rows of this and walking through the Canada Pavilion, and I generally think I'm like, I remember thinking in that moment, it's like I thought like, I'm a good BC producer, like people know who I am, they know our company, like we're well known. And then walking through those wings, I was like, wow, I am nobody.
Right.
Like
Yeah.
there are
You're a
so
speck
many.
of dust in
There
the.
a speck of dust is exactly how I felt in that moment. It's just like, I am nobody. Nobody knows who I am. My God, like there's just so much, like it is very overwhelming. A market is very overwhelming if you haven't been before. So it was
Yeah.
very much a trial by fire. And I really just took that in stride. I was also there. I was participating in Telefilm's Producers Without Borders program, which I traveled with a small cohort from Canada. So that helped a little bit. I was with a directing colleague as well, Asia Youngman. We were traveling together on that.
I love Asia. Yeah, she's great.
She had been before, so she sort of held my hand a little bit through the experience, and but that was a good way to sort of dip my toes in. I made a few meetings, not as many as I should have, but it was a good way to sort of get introduced to that. But from there going on, throughout the rest of that year, I attended Hot Docs, I attended TIFF, I attended the American Film Market in LA. So I knew I had to have a better strategy. I knew I had to make meetings 4 to 6 weeks out, because that's when people start to fill their calendars. So I started to put those requests in 6 weeks ahead of time. And so I could fill my days, essentially, because you want to be as productive as you can while you're there, and make use of the time. But and I think, to your point, Ken, have clear and specific goals. If you're pitching a project, okay, you're pitching a project, but be prepared to pitch, know who you're pitching to, do the due diligence on those sales agents or those companies, whoever you're pitching to, know your film, know who you are, and know what you're doing. Or if it's just networking, again, having a clear plan of like, who do I want to network with? Like, do I want to, meet other producers? Do I want to talk to sales agents? Do I want to, participate in the co-production activities? It's like really having a clear, defined series of goals is how you're most efficient at those markets, I find. But, going back to what I said about EFM being vital, that's what I've been told from producers and consultants over the years, is like, if you want to get a film financed, Berlin is the market to go to. And then, as the year sort of goes on, Cannes is the market to follow up on. And then as we get closer to the end of the year, American film market is typically in November. Hopefully you've sold or closing a deal by that point. But yeah, market travel is a big part of what I do, and takes a big chunk of time. And an example of that is, this past year I was in Berlin in February. I met with a sales agent based in Spain. We connected on a project. We want to work together, started structuring a deal. Here we are, May 17th. We're just getting around to paperwork now.
Yeah.
So things like that take a lot of time. But it's important to get that face time, get in front of those people, start the conversation, and then you can, continue that process throughout.
You keep pointing at EFM as being a really important one to go to. Is that just because of where it lands in the calendar year? Or is it because EFM has a very special, this is the place to go if you want to be an indie filmmaker, and all the other ones are kind of like, you go there second, you go there third, you go there fourth? Is there like a strategy of which markets to attend and when?
Again, what I've been told from colleagues and consultants, and sort of what I've figured, I guess, for myself, is I think what you're saying is, because Berlin lands sort of in February, right at the beginning of the calendar year, that's a key one to sort of kick things off at, and start getting traction on projects. Something I've heard over the years about Berlin is it's a good development market. So it's a good place to introduce projects, projects that you're in the process of packaging. You might have a key piece of talent or something like that attached, or a director you're talking to. But then as you go forward through the year, as you're approaching Cannes, then that's a great market to sort of follow up on. I've personally never attended Cannes because it is cost prohibitive for sure. I mean, again, I've never attended, so maybe it's not my place to say, but I think it's just such a busy, oversubscribed marketplace that I'd almost rather, I tend to focus my effort on Berlin at the beginning of the year, and then just doing my own individual like follow-ups throughout the year. AFM is one I've attended in the past. It's not a great market for producers. I've found it's really more of a sales environment, like sales execs and buyers. That's really their
completed films, trying to find sales agents and distributors, correct?
Yeah, and I think part of that is the position at in the year. Like it's nearing the end of the year. Like, buyers, want to fill their slots. Sales agents want to, sell their catalogs. But I think also, just for lack of a better word, the intensity of the market there, I would find it's less filmmaker friendly, more buyer friendly. Whereas I would say the reverse of something like EFM, because it's directly tied to Berlinale, one of the biggest, most prestigious film festivals in the world. It's definitely more of a filmmaker friendly environment.
What about TIFF? It seems to be the one that everybody in Canada goes to. But as an indie producer, what are you getting out of it going there?
I think as an independent producer, it's like, so, well, I'll just preface it by saying is like, I tend to like to make 2 trips to Toronto a year, Hot Docs and TIFF, because one is sort of positioned in the spring, one's positioned in the fall. And it works out for us because we develop and produce both documentary and narrative. Like, obviously not every production company is going to need to make a trip to Hot Docs, but that's how it works for us. But I think TIFF is the ultimate like Canadian networking environment. I think any serious producer is at TIFF almost every year or every couple years, or makes an appearance, when they can. And I don't want that statement to alienate anybody.
But come on, like if you're a producer in Canada and you're not going to TIFF, go to TIFF. Yes.
Yeah, you need to go to TIFF. It is sort of an unofficial market environment right now. Like, a lot of business gets done there. They are starting an official market in 2026, I believe. I think that's excellent because it's already sort of an unofficial place. Like, a lot of buying and selling happens there, obviously. But I think just having that additional market position in the calendar will be hugely beneficial. And I think ultimately they're doing it obviously to raise attendance and things like that. And I think that'll draw in more buyers, draw in more producers. It'll be interesting to see what effect that has on AFM, to be honest, because they're going to be so close together now. And I know this probably isn't the podcast to get into the nitty gritty of this, but AFM has had some trouble these last couple years. Like, they've had a couple disastrous additions.
Oh, we can get into anything. We can get into this is so interesting.
Like, they moved it to Vegas.
They moved to Vegas, and now it's coming back to LA. It's back to Century City, I think. So it'll be interesting to see how this year plays out. I am planning on attending AFM at the end of this year, so I'll see if I can get that firsthand opinion. But I mean, starting next year, you're going to have the TIFF market in September, and then AFM in November, and it's the same buyers are going to be traveling to both. So it'll be interesting to see what that means sort of for the market.
Well, and Toronto has the largest, like, commercially, I guess, successful film festival in the world, basically now, right?
And I've talked to a couple of our distribution partners about this, like, what are your opinions on, how that's going to work? And, sort of what I've heard is like, well, we see most of the sales agents or the people we want to see, the buyers, at TIFF. So what's the point of going to LA 2 months later? So if that's already sort of the position, it'll be interesting to see when that official market launches, what that means. But, for me as a producer, I think it's just great that there's going to be that official market launched, but at the same time, it is sort of business as usual in that sense.
I'd love to dive into distribution because, your film has screened at 73 screens across Canada, which is fantastically great number. I'd love to just know more about that process of partnering with a distributor, what that means as far as, your stake in a film, what people can expect a deal to look like a typical distribution deal, and sort of how you work with a distributor to make sure that your goals for the film are aligned with what they're doing.
The first recommendation I would say to anybody, independent producers out there, is form relationships with all the distributors in Canada, because we don't have very many. Like, I could probably count on 2 hands how many distributors there are. And I think it's important to maintain relationships with as many as possible, just because some of them, specialize in different things. Some of them are better at other things. Ultimately, they're all pointed towards the same goal. There's a couple of those distribution companies that are larger, that are going to look at probably specifically larger projects with cast attachments or director attachments. When I say that, I'm thinking of like Elevation Pictures. I'm thinking of Mongrel Media. The partners we've worked with have been, I hesitate to say the word smaller because I don't want to offend them, but I guess more boutique in that sense, like Game Theory Films. Vortex Media has been a fantastic partner to us across 2 projects now. And on Pearl Power, we worked with Impact Partners. And in all of my experiences with distributors up to this point, we've usually been engaging them later on in the process, usually during a rough cut phase or even at a finished product phase. So for example, Wild Goat Surf, Vortex Media came on board once they had seen the rough cut of the film, and they came on at that point, and they really loved it and wanted to be a part of it at that point. Pearl Power was actually like a standard market sale. Like we were official selection at Hot Docs, but we were also taking the film to the marketplace at that time. And Impact Partners saw the film at Hot Docs and made an offer at that time to pick up the distribution rights for Canada. So that was, I guess, a straightforward sort of market sale, if you want to say that, but coming on board when the film was already finished. One of the things that I've experienced working with distributors, and this is based on sort of how we've put the financial models together for our projects, is the most important piece of revenue for a film and for a distributor is the pay one window. So the pay one window being sort of the first broadcast or streaming window that's available for a project. That's the most lucrative piece of revenue that a producer or a distribution company can hope to get. And in a lot of our cases with projects like Wild Goat Surf and Crow Power, we've actually pre-sold the pay one window. Pre-selling the pay one window has allowed us to put that money into our financing plans and has either, boosted the budget or allowed us to trigger other funds and things like that. So that's how we've gone about some of these lower budget projects.
And that was basically part of your soft money approach to putting this budget together. Is part of that budget is your pre-sale, which you've established a relationship with beforehand.
You're pre-selling that through that distributor, or are you pre-selling that you just got that relationship with the broadcaster?
Pre-selling those independently based on relationships with the broadcaster, because then I can take that money, put it into my financial structure. Maybe that will allow me to trigger, a broadcast pre-license would allow me to trigger CMF money, Canada Media Fund money. So a part of sort of the soft money approach. What I will say is it's not necessarily the best way to approach a relationship with a distributor, I think, to do that.
Yeah, because you've already taken away their big thing.
I've basically taken their meal ticket off the table,
Yeah.
And this goes to a conversation, unfortunately, theatrical is not a lucrative business model in Canada, but I mean, I think we're seeing the decline of that worldwide. But in Canada, it's not a lucrative business model for these distributors. It's really about exposure. It's really about the ability to get filmmakers' names out there, get producers' names out there. Then that reflects nicely to Telefilm to see that you have theatrically released films. I mean, it looks good on anybody's resume, but it's something that I've been trying to work on, is how do we do this better? Because, this is a relationships business. I want everybody to come out happy at the end of it, right? And so I want the distributor to be able to, make their money, because if the distributor makes money, then I make money.
Right.
So it's really beneficial for everybody. So I don't love the idea of taking, their meal ticket away, but that's generally what we've done with these projects. I mean, Curl Power was a bit of an interesting situation in the sense that it was never thought to be a theatrical documentary. We always thought it was going to be strictly a TELUS original film, a TV documentary in that sense. But just as we, sort of finished the film, as it began its festival run, it was just like, no, I think we have some opportunity to turn this into a theatrical experience, which we were able to do with our partners at Impact Partners, and they supported it. Like at the beginning, we talked about 73 screens across Canada. I don't know a lot of documentaries that are getting that.
Yeah, it's huge.
No, that's massive.
Like even our narrative stuff is not getting anywhere near that. Like 73 screens is massive. So, my hat's off to them for supporting it so fulsomely. And seeing the vision for that. That was never directly thought of, but something like Wild Goat Surf, we knew we had to get the budget to a certain place, and the only way we were going to be able to do that was to do a pre-sale. A pre-sale with a distributor was not viable at that time because, first time director, no major cast, execution dependent. But at that time, Crave was really pre-buying films from new directors. So that was an opportunity that we took. But like going back to what I was saying is like, yeah, I want to be able to, find a way to work with distributors a bit early on. Like that's what we're a bit more early, I should say.
Yeah.
Is that something I'm even doing now is, working with distributors as early as putting together the financing. It's like, look, here's my financing plan. Here's what I think I have to do. What do you think? Like, where can you contribute? where can we, where can we make a deal that makes sense for you, that you're still benefiting from the revenue stream, the down windows that are available to you, but I still have contribution from you so I can close my financing. So working on it in more of in a team capacity, because they are a part of the team. Distributors are a vital part of the team. And I think that's something that, again, I hate to keep using the word demystify, but something that has to be demystified a little bit. I think there's a lot of negative energy out there sometimes about distributors, that they just want to screw you over and take your money. And I mean, there's certainly people out there that want to do that, but again, it's like you find the right partners, you develop the right relationships. Everybody wants to win. Everybody wants to benefit.
I think that's an important point, because like the big debate that we've been having with multiple people on this podcast and what we talk about, and sort of, just seeing where the industry's going right now is, this idea of, we spend so much time developing a project and finding the financing and shooting it and editing it. And this is now years of your life that goes into this. And then all of a sudden you take this thing that you've created and you give it to somebody else, a distributor, and you kind of lose control of that. And obviously there are horror stories out there of distributors completely tanking things or abusing it. It just happened last year with this amazing movie called Strange Darling, where the distributor hired this marketing firm that lied about their numbers, and basically the movie failed. And I mean, they're in court now, so I'm not going to get into that. But the point is, there's this also this idea of like the Steve Jobs or the Akio Morita idea of like, you build a product, you sell the product, you control the user experience from end to end. So how, as filmmakers, can we control the audience experience from the development side all the way to the theatrical release or the streaming side? And I think what you just said is the key for me about finding that balance. Is just, you have to find the distributors that you can work with, that are a part of the team, that aren't just these entities that are going to take your film and do what they will with it. I love the idea of bringing them in early, if there's a way to strike that deal. And obviously they're looking at it from a sales perspective. That's their job, to sell this movie, of who's in the movie, how much does it cost, will this thing sell? But if there is a way to bring them in early, or maybe find a way to restructure that deal, I feel like we are at a moment where that might be possible, based on the theatrical, windows right now, and sort of what that means as far as movie theaters and exhibition versus streaming, and what the possibilities are. So anyway, I just wanted to say I really like your approach to all of this. I think it's really smart.
I think it all goes back to that word, like relationships. I always kind of say to people, like, I think you can be the most creative nutbag on the planet, but if you're not able to talk to people, if you're not able to engage partners, open yourself up to like kind of be vulnerable in a way, then you're never going to move forward. And when I say be vulnerable, that's been a big learning experience for me. I think earlier on in my career, working with distributors or broadcasters or other partners, I was very like protective of like budgets and financing, and didn't want to like share things too widely, because I felt like I had to keep that close to the chest, But I think, as I've gone on, I've learned it's like, no, if they want to be a part of something, like they're investing in you, like they're investing in people, or they're investing in a vision or something. So, let them in, and I think that's something I've learned. It's like, listen, I have this finance plan. I need to raise this much money. I've got this big of a gap. How can we work together to make it work? And you know what? Sometimes the answer is no, because the thing is about this business is it is a blend of art and commerce. And you have to, I think where it works is where it goes right down the middle. If you lean too far to the commerce side, we make horrible movies. They might make money, but that's how you get like, giant shark movies, like they're taking over, cities and stuff like that.
Deep Blue Sea 3.
Yeah, exactly. Sharknado 7. That's how you get that. But if we lean too far on the art side, it's hard to export that. It's hard to get that to theaters. It's hard to get that to video on demand. So you have to go right down the middle. And, and I do have conversations where it's like, sorry, we just can't make this work. We just don't see the money in it. And I think sometimes people take that, personally, and certainly earlier on in my career, I did, but I think I've learned it's just like, at the end of the day, this is a business. Everybody has to see their money in it, and I don't just mean physical money, but it's like, what are we getting out of it, be it exposure or, actual, dollars and cents.
The idea of the value, right? Like you like what
Yes,
it they have to see value in what you have there, and if they're not seeing it yet, that doesn't necessarily mean the project isn't good. It just might be that it needs another perspective, or it needs a change in how you're approaching it, right?
absolutely. And I think that speaks to the development process as well. Like when I was talking about, the development process is so much more than just script development. It's like adding that value, like you're talking about, is how do we add value? Because, an idea, even a first draft script, generally isn't worth anything, but it's
Right.
like,
Yeah.
how do we add the value to that? What is the story? What is the story behind the story that adds value? Who are the people we can get involved that add value to it? So I think, and that's part of the reason of sort of engaging distributors earlier on, if you can, is because they can help add those pieces of value too. And just before we move on from this, I did just want to mention a sort of an interesting story as we're talking about distribution. Is, we had a scenario on Wild Goat Surf when we were working with our distributors where, I hope she doesn't mind me mentioning her name, but Kate, the director of Wild Goat Surf, like, we were both very much like this. This was really both of our first experiences working with a distributor that was cutting the trailer and making all of the marketing materials with us, which is, when I was doing shorts and stuff like that, you're making all that stuff yourself because you can't
Yeah.
afford to hire anybody to do it. And I remember, we were doing versions and versions of trailers and posters, and they weren't, Kate wasn't quite happy with them. And we were trying to figure out what it was. And then we sort of had this moment where it clicked, and it was like, oh, I get it now. We were trying to make posters and trailers that were very, very artful, very indie, very like, sort of teaser. We didn't want to give too much away. We wanted them to be artful and stuff like that. And then in talking with not just our distributors, but with the company that they were using to make the materials, you can't just do that. Because that doesn't put asses in seats, for lack of a better word. And I was like, oh,
Mhm.
because these trailer companies knew what pieces of the movie to put in the trailer that would attract people
Yeah.
to buy tickets. And that was the thing, the big conversation we had with the poster is like, we don't just want a poster that looks good. We need a poster that if people are walking by at International Village and they see that row of posters, they don't know what those movies are. It's like, oh, Wild Goat Surf, that looks really interesting. I'm going to buy a ticket for that. So that was a big sort of wake up call for, I think, both of us, was like, you almost have to be prepared to pass the baton. Is like, yes, it's like you're still engaged in the distribution process, but it's like, that's when they're bringing in marketing and publicity people and all these people that know how to do marketing and publicity better than you, frankly. So it's like, you have to be ready to, like, you're still a part of the team, but you're passing the baton to the next people who are going to help you do it. I know there's a lot of discussion around distribution and the viability of like self-distribution. Like, should we be self-distributing our films instead of, working with distributors? I still believe in working with, proper distributors for that reason of, it's like, at some point you got to pass the baton. And I think for us as a company, it's like, when we're developing new projects and trying to grow our slate and scale our business, is like, to continually like be self-distributing project, it would just be too much for our small company. So we still believe in that sort of traditional model. I think there is lots of conversation to have about it, and producers have to understand their rights and what rights they're licensing away. Like, we're at a point too where it's like, you can make deals where you're not giving away all your rights. Actually, here's another case study. Wild Goat Surf again. We sold the project to a US distributor. They didn't want to take the theatrical rights because they didn't see theatrical value in it for the US, which was fine. But we had a conversation. It's like, well, okay, well, that's fine. We'll hold on to the theatrical rights. You can have the other rights, do it because you guys, have a great digital distribution model. You focus on digital. We'll hold on to those theatrical rights. And then what we ended up doing is we ended up working with Look Cinemas in the US to four-wall a couple theaters. And we just did that independently. But we got the film into theaters in the US by ourselves. But we wouldn't have been able to do that if they had taken all the rights. So that's something
Yeah.
to keep in mind too, is like, we're at a point where it's like, you can customize those deals more and more.
That's brilliant. And that's exactly what I'm like, where my mind is at these days is like both Anthony and I are putting together our own features and we're looking at models of how to, distribute these movies and knowing that it's possible now to not just give away the farm, right? And is Look Cinema, what are they, a theater booker or a distributor or?
They're a small chain of movie theaters based in the US. They're kind of all over. They've got Texas and Virginia and New York and LA. Like they're
Cool.
they're not
Yeah.
huge. They're not AMC or anything like that, but they're a chain of dine-in theaters. And we actually heard about it through, I think, a project that you worked on, Anthony, a film called Reuniting.
Oh, Laura Adkins. Yeah, great.
Her and Kate talked about it, and that's how we found out about it. And we reached out to Look directly. I think they do this on a somewhat regular basis. They have to like the film, obviously. So luckily they liked it, and they were able to put it in theaters in New York, LA, and Virginia during the first week of April. And that was a really cool experience. Like I'd never done that sort of four-walling method before. Our mistake was we opened the same week as Minecraft movie. I wouldn't do that again. Just can't win. We can't win with those guys. But it was a cool experience. And like you're saying, is like, yeah, it was an opportunity for us to remain a bit more in the driver's seat with that.
Yeah.
It wasn't no one's getting rich off of that. Nobody's retiring early off of that. But it was a great way to get exposure in the US, say that we had a theatrical release in the US. And ultimately that stuff can help you qualify and trigger other funds and awards and stuff like that. So it was a worthwhile process for all those reasons.
Gives you an opportunity, like you were saying, to kind of build your branding of your own company. Like we've got movies that get into theaters. Theaters is still the romantic place that we want to see movies. It might not be the financial place we want to see movies these days. It sounds like that's kind of what you're saying.
Absolutely. I believe that to be the case. Like, and it's hard for me to admit because I consider myself the ultimate cinephile. Like, I think I see a movie a week when I can. Like it's in theaters, like, cause it's just that perfect environment. Like for me, like I could shut my brain off when the lights go down and I prefer that environment. But, I think what we're finding with, how people are consuming content, consuming film and TV, those viewing patterns are changing. And I think ultimately it's just hard for Canadian films to find the shelf space, for lack of a better word. It's like when you're competing against, like I remember when we released Wild Goat Surf in theaters, what we were up against. I think week 1 we were up against The Fall Guy with Ryan Gosling, and then week 2 we were up against like Planet of the Apes. And it's just like and that's nobody's fault. Like I don't blame Cineplex for that. I don't blame our distributor for that. I think our distributor did the right thing. They released the film in the summer window. It's a summer movie. Like it would have made no sense if they just dropped it in, December, so it was all the right strategy, all the right approach, but it's just like, the average person is going to go see Planet of the Apes. They're not going to go see Wild Goat Surf. Even, something we've noticed is like we released that film in May 2024. It premiered on Crave in March 2025. And I got much, much more engagement, many more messages about the film that way than theatrically. That's where people are engaging with that sort of content.
So now basically the takeaway here on that point is just that, like, as you said, like the first window is the streaming window now for distributors.
Yes.
Like that's the most important piece of the pie.
Yes. Yeah, because it's the most lucrative from a revenue perspective. And I think from an engagement perspective, that's where you're going to see things. Cause I think, I've listened to lots of podcasts and read lots of studies. It's like, and I've done this myself of like, you could watch something on video on demand. I could rent that for $5.99, or I'll just wait until it hits a streamer.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Which I think is ultimately what we experienced with Wild Goat Surf. Is like, I didn't hear about a lot of people renting Wild Goat Surf. I heard about a lot of people watching it on Crave after the fact. So it's not just lucrative from a revenue perspective, but I think it's lucrative from an engagement perspective as well.
Just to clarify, so your Crave deal for Wild Goat Surf, when was that a part of the equation? Was that early on, or did that happen later?
Very early on. So that was a pre-sale. So that happened like we got our Telefilm money. So again, sort of going to that model of Telefilm being the first in. And then I think we approached Crave at that time to be a part of the film, and they pre-bought it. So that license from Crave went directly to us as producers for us to apply to the financial model.
But you had to wait a year for them to be able to release it on their platform?
Yeah, there is different, I guess, structures of how they do that. I mean, in our case, what we were trying to do is line up the theatrical, line up the VOD release, and then line up the, call it the streaming release, the Crave release. Because we didn't do it through our distributor, we wanted to make sure we were respecting sort of their windows. Like, we didn't want to release it at the same time in theaters and on streaming, because then nobody would have gone to see it in theaters, right? Through Vortex, we tried to give it like a 30-day exclusive in theaters, and then it went to 90-day exclusive in VOD. And then from there, it was just a matter of getting on Crave's calendar.
Look, I feel like we can just keep going and going and going. And Mike, we have to have you back on this podcast because like I find this stuff so interesting as well. But look, we've taken up so much of your time, and we really appreciate this. This is so interesting, and I know people are learning a ton listening to you talk about this. But as we wrap up here, we usually ask our guests if they have one piece of advice for an up and coming filmmaker or a producer, anybody, what's that piece of advice that you have for anybody just starting out?
Ooh, it's a good question. There would be so many, realistically. But I think one that I come back to a lot is, obviously management of expectations. And when I say that is like, if you're a emerging producer or you're working with a first time director, you're probably not making Oppenheimer, but what is the value that you can add to make the execution of that so great that it takes you to the next thing. But also, as an independent producer, I would say understand what you're getting into to a degree. And what I mean by that is going back to this demystification of the producer role is, as an independent producer, is like, there's no safety net in a degree.
Right.
An independent producer is I always kind of make the comparison, we're high stakes gamblers, like we're sort of, in a lot of ways, we're taking a piece of material, betting it all on black and, and hoping for the best. But you also have to think about, it's like, okay, well, what happens if, this piece of financing falls through? What happens if this project gets pushed back because we lose a cast member? Or what happens if we go over budget? Like, it's not studio filmmaking, where you have somebody who can bail you out. So I think, I've noticed a lot, because there is no barrier to entry to our business. And, certainly that was one way I got started, is like, I was able to move up quickly because there was no barrier. But I think, sometimes there's the romance of what the role is, and then there's the actuality of what the role is. I find it's a roller coaster ride. Sometimes you're top of the mountain, and then sometimes you're bottom of the mountain. And quite frankly, there's a lot more bottoms than there are tops. So how do you deal with that? How do you stay true to yourself, but how do you manage those challenges? Because every day there's a new challenge. I kind of tell myself that as soon as my feet hit the floor in the morning, I've got 100 fires to put out. And that's generally accurate.
That's so true.
How do you manage that then? Like, what do you do to kind of keep that roller coaster from consuming you?
Another great question. I mean, I wouldn't say I've always been 100% successful with it, but I mean, what I've learned is sort of the separation of church and state. And what I mean by that is like not taking the work so personal. And it's tough because, like I work with 3 of my all-time closest friends and people I would absolutely go to war with. And I want to protect them and guide them and uplift them and everything. So when things do go wrong or challenges come up, it's like I'm a very solutions-based person. Like I want to jump in and find the solution right away. And I almost want to like bear all of that on me. But I've learned you don't have to do that. Like don't be afraid to ask for help, but also don't be afraid to like, don't take it all so personally. Like if a piece of financing falls through, it's like, oh, that wasn't my fault. It was like, unfortunately, these things happen. But, I mean, nine times out of 10, it's not your fault anyway.
But there's that one time.
There's that one time where it might have been, yeah. But I think, yeah, just trying not to take it so personally. I mean, I've been trying to do better with also, finding, hobbies and activities outside of film, which I haven't been always so successful with in the past. That being said, going to the movies is like therapy for me. Like when those lights go down and it gets quiet, it's just like a nice place. That's kind of my church in a way. Right. Is like that's a place that I feel like I can just sort of like take a breather and just sort of disconnect from all the stuff that's going on with my own movies. I can just experience this. So I mean, I think, yeah, it's things like that. It's like, not thinking like the whole world is on your shoulders, I think is the biggest lesson I've sort of have to learn. It's like, at the end of the day, we're making movies. We're not trying to cure cancer. I think that's an important delineation. And that's not to say that these movies aren't important or don't mean a lot to me. They all do. Every movie that we do take on is very important to me. But it's not the end of the world. And you'll always find a way. It just might not happen as quickly as you'd like it to, or in the way you'd like it to. But you find a way.
I love it. Well, thank you so much, Mike. Really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me on. This was great.
Thanks, Mike.
Okay, so that's it for this week's episode of Off the Lot. We want to hear from you. If there are any topics you want covered or any questions you'd like answered, please email us at podcast.offthelot@gmail.com.
You can also find us on Instagram and YouTube. Our handles are in the show notes. Be sure to like, follow, and subscribe. And share this with your friends. See you next week.